Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part 6 of an ongoing discussion dealing with ConfigMgr 2012. Today's discussion, really what I want to do is kind of look back to what we talked about in part 5. In part 5, we introduced the idea of leveraging different logic inside the task sequence to direct the flow of events, right, and give a lot of great flexibility in terms of knowing how the task sequence is going to run, building the task sequence to accommodate a bunch of different scenarios. And a key piece of that logic control is the ability to set task sequence variables. So I want to spend a little bit of time. This session won't be as long as maybe half an hour or so. Some of the other sessions have been a little bit longer, but I thought important to walk through some of the ways that we can work with task sequence variables in the task sequence itself, externally, and so on. And that's what I want to do in this session. So I want to talk, first of all, a little bit about the task sequencing environment, talk about the variables itself, how to define those, work with those inside the task sequence, gain insight into them. Then finally, how to work with variables in collections and on devices. So in terms of the task sequencing environment, just a couple of things, right? My own experiences, I was learning task sequencing, right? I was kind of expecting things to work the way they work in the OS. So it was very knee-jerk for me to just simply go into the command prompt and hit, type in set and get the results set. These are all the environment variables, as you would expect. This is a normal list. And we don't have a task sequence running right now. But when I did have a task sequence running and I just went into the command prompt and I typed set, I expected to see the task sequence variables. I didn't, right? Because when a task sequence is running, it is running inside its own isolated environment. So you can't use external ways such as using set or different things to pull out the task sequence variables. You have to use tie-ins to that environment specifically itself. Right? So there are ways to do that, right? There are ways, but you have to first understand that it's a separate environment. Right? And I'll show you how to get into that environment in just a second. Another thing to understand, and again, these task sequences happen so quick I really probably can't show you. Should have made a longer running task sequence, I didn't. But when I was first looking into variables and trying to understand them in the task sequence world, I was trying to figure out where are they stored. Are they in WMI? Are they on the file system? Are they in the registry? Where are they? Right? Well, the answer is they're stored in a file called variables.dat. Right? Variables.dat. Well, this is a file you'll see on the hard disk, but if you try to open it, you'll find out that it's not readable. It's encrypted. Right? It's an encrypted file because there's some information in here that would be considered sensitive, some passwords and different things, right? And certainly as an administrator, being able to open this file, seeing passwords, probably not that big a deal. You probably set them yourself anyway. But for that reason, we just don't want to leave it wide open on the hard drive. So knowing that the values are there doesn't really help you that much, except as trivia. But being able to tap into them programmatically would help you, right? So how do we do that? So there are a couple of ways to programmatically tap into the task sequencing environment, and I call the idea dumping, task sequence variables. So let me go in and show you how to use code to programmatically access the task sequence environment and be able to manipulate or at least view variables. All right, so I'll pull in this case, my site server. I've got a couple of task sequences here that are built, the demo TS variables. The first one I have is just a very basic dump base variables, and you'll see I have two ways that I'm doing this. One is through VBScript, and just simply a run command line step to run this ts var_dump.vbs. And let me show you the script. It's actually very simple. So if I look, oops, wrong folder. If I look at my package source folder and my ts demo, you'll see this ts var_dump file in VBScript. And if I open it, it's really simple. So all I have is a line right here where I am setting the variable ts environment to the Microsoft task sequencing environment. It is a specific environment I have to instantiate, and just like any other object in in code, there are methods and different things that I can call. Like here's a method called getVariables. So I'm simply running this code and leveraging this code to reach into the task sequence environment and pull out all of the variables. And then I'm looping through every variable that I find, and I'm writing it out to a file, the variable name, and then also the value for the variable, right? So if I go run this, you'll see it, and I'll show it to you in just a minute. This actually, as was seen in the task sequence, will drop its information to a text file. So I just simply pipe it to a text file. Well, I can do similar things in PowerShell, right? Here I'm just using the task sequence step to run a PowerShell command, tsvar_dump.ps1. So if I go look at this file, open it in Notepad, again, it's fairly simple. Just a little bit more here. I don't need some of these things, but you see I'm instantiating TS environment again, variable, the object, COM object, Microsoft SMS TS environment. Here I'm setting a variable that I don't need, but just to show it, log path, I can actually retrieve the log path. This is a variable, right? This is how I will reference a value in a variable. This is interesting, right? Because with code, you don't have to set conditionals in a step in a task sequence. If you wanted to, you could just run code and have the code do different things based on the existence of a variable or a value for a variable or whatever, right? That's kind of getting off in the weeds, but I wanted to show it to you because that's a flexibility too. So here all we're doing is pulling the value of SMSTS log path and storing it in my variable, right? Well, then I'm going to set the value variables to the get variables, the results of the get variables method, just like you saw in VBScript. And here I'm just going to loop through and write out every variable name. I'm not really going to show the value. I could, just like I did in VBScript, I could add that in and put the value there too. But here I'm just showing it, right? And notice that I'm not really piping this to a text file. And when I don't do that, like when I do a write host or the equivalent in VBScript or whatever, this will actually dump the information into the SMSTS log. So let me go run through that and show you how it works in both cases, right? So let me pull in the other lab machine where I have this variable set. So if I go into the root of the C drive, that's where I would expect one of these to show up, and it's not there. So not cheating or anything, it's just not there yet. So let me go ahead and run this task sequence. And I've run these before, right? But I'm just going to go ahead and reinstall them so you see it work. And what you'll see is that the task sequence comes up. It has two steps. The first one is to dump by VBS. It runs, and now it dumps by PowerShell, and it runs. This _SMS task sequence folder is a temporary location. I could drill into this if I wanted to. If I'm quick enough, I'm not. Oops. I'll try it next time. In fact, let me try to run it again real fast. It'll just recreate what I already have. No big deal. But let me see if I can get to this folder real fast. And you'll see just a little bit of detail. You can always get to this yourself. But like there's that TS, oh, not variables.dat, tsnv.dat. Sorry, that was my bad. But you saw it real quick, right? Now, once we get finished running the task sequence, then we will get rid of that folder because it's just temporary. But the log file will actually move under the normal log files directory on this client. So I'll go there in a minute. But first, let me just start here. So you see that I have all of the task sequence variables listed, and in some cases they're defined, right? And I'll see what the item is, the variable is defined to, right? So you can scroll down through here and see a lot of things. You'll see that there's some longer definitions, and there's password in here at least one place if I were to slow down long enough to let you see it. A question has arisen sometimes about, is there a field length? I don't honestly know if there's a field length for the variables. You'll see that there are some fairly long variable strings defined in here, so it's not a small string of data that you can put together. There was also a question I heard at one point that I don't know the answer to either about special characters. Do we allow special symbol characters and things like that as variable names? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If you have a scenario for that kind of thing, it's fairly easy to test, but I don't know off the top of my head. But this is a listing of all those variables, and these are all of the built-in ones. So if you're trying to understand troubleshooting, interest level, whatever reason that you have for wanting to know what these variables are set to. They're not that hard to get access to and to dump out through this, right? Well, in the same way we can get to them in VBScript, we can get to them in PowerShell as well. So I have the logs. I'll just go ahead and get rid of this file because I'm going to recreate it in a moment. I have the logs. And if I go down to SMSTS, this is from my recent run. You can tell by the timestamp, right? And if I scroll up, you'll see I don't have the values here, but I do instantiate all of the variables. So these are all variables that are dumped by that PowerShell script. Here, yeah. So just be aware that if you're running a VB script or a PowerShell script and you don't specifically tell it to write out its data in a certain place, but you do ask for writing to the console or outputting a string in the script or whatever, it will actually do that, but in the log, which is useful, but it also makes the log longer, right? So use your choice, whichever one works for you, but at least know it's here, right? Okay, let me pull this back out and pull this back out and move on, right? So that's dumping the task sequence variables. It works. It's very effective. It's very useful, especially if you're trying to troubleshoot. Maybe you create your own custom variables and you want to troubleshoot those, how they're appearing, whatever. You can use this. So the idea then dovetails nicely with the idea of adding a variable in the task sequence. So there's several ways you can do that. Just like we talked about, you can do these things manually. Let me pull the lab back in. Go to the properties on the task sequence. Here is my task sequence where I've added a couple of steps to add variables, but certainly there is the option to set a task sequence variable. So just like any other task sequence step, there's one for this, and you could use this step to declare your variable name, declare your variable value, and then leverage that later on in the script. Might be a reason that you would want to do that. Maybe there's a static value that you want to declare based on whatever need, right? Declaring a value statically is not as flexible. I mean, you could actually have steps, like you can have 4 or 5 different task sequence variable declaration steps, right? So let me just add this in, right? I could have 4 or 5 of these, and I could have conditionals on here and simply read WMI and say, okay, if it's this model of machine, then I want to declare the variable this way. If it's this other model machine, I want to declare it this way. And you'd have 4 or 5 steps. The only one that fires is when you match a model of machine, and so you set your variables that way. That's potentially a lot of set variable steps to get one variable declared, right? So there's other ways you can do it too. Right? You can definitely go in and declare variables based on code. And that's what I have here. So I'm adding a custom variable in VBScript. I'll show this to you in a minute. But some of the scenarios that you might want to cover. Working with a customer, one scenario that came up was that different systems had different size disks, and we wanted to partition and format differently based on the disk size. So we wanted to figure out what the disk size was and then set a variable that we could then leverage in the format and partition steps to create the partitions carved up different ways. And we ended up doing it all in the script, but you get the idea, right? So if you go through in script and query WMI and figure out what the settings are and then have different conditions to set variables different ways, it's very easy. And so the example here is simple, but it illustrates the capability to create these variables. So let me show it to you. So TS create variable in VB is simply this. So I'm still instantiating my task sequencing environment, and here all I'm doing, right, is setting this value. So I'm just like we saw earlier whenever we were using the underscore log to retrieve the value, I'm just declaring the name custom variable, and then I'm declaring the value custom. So this is a new variable, but notice in the comment you could use this same kind of code to reset the value of an existing variable if you wanted to, right? You don't have to declare a new one. You could adjust the value of an existing one in code, no problem, right? And then I'm going to run through here. Actually, I think I left that over. Doesn't really, not really needed for this. But there'll be another step later on to go dump out these variables, right? And you'll see it. Well, just like I can do it in VBScript, I can do it in PowerShell as well. Right? So I'm going to open that with Notepad, and you'll see Here, again, I'm instantiating the environment. Here, I'm just simply calling and setting the value custom variable PowerShell to this. So the idea is whenever I run the task sequence, you will see the variables show up. So here's where I'm setting them, right? VBScript and PowerShell. And actually, I'm going to use this one. Do you really want to exit? Yes. So I'm going to use this one, right? Which has an additional couple of steps to dump the task sequences or variables into another file. So I'll end up with two files here, right? But let's go run this, right? Because I'll get the variables declared, and then I will be able to see those variables. So let me go look at this. Here's my lab machine. I'm not going to keep looking in the TS log. You get the idea. You could see some of the stuff just as clearly there, but let me run this. So after I do my custom add, this is the 6 steps. I'm going to reinstall that. Here's my C drive. Right, here we go. So we're dumping in VBScript, dumping in PowerShell. We have the same file we saw. We're adding our custom variable in VBScript. Then we'll do the same thing in PowerShell. And then we'll dump out those values again. Here's dump variable 2. So now, in fact, I see both of those variables are added to my PowerShell environment. So I can leverage them, use them, do whatever I want to with them later on. Right? Okay. So that's all adding adding variables and such through the task sequence itself. Works beautifully, great flexibility, really cool options to be able to do that. But what if you want to have an external way to add variables? So we've talked about, in fact, I'll just talk about these all together, collections and the device, right? We've talked about that it is totally possible in ConfigMgr to populate variables to a task sequence by adding them to a collection or adding them to a device. So here's my collection I'm targeting for my demo task sequences. Here's my machine that I'm targeting for my demo task sequences. If I go into the properties of this particular collection, or any collection, device collection anyway, you'll see collection variables, and you can manually add those variables. You can specify the name, the value, right? This is actually setting what's called a mask, which says whether the values are visible or not, right? Right. And you'll see that in PowerShell in just a minute. Well, I can do the same thing on the machine, right? So here's my machine, here's my variables. I can declare just the same way. So the question comes up then, okay, cool. Well, if you can declare on the collection, if you can declare on the machine, why would you declare in one place or the other? Or would you declare both? Well, the answer really is up to what you're trying to do. If you declare a variable or set of variables on the collection, then every machine that's in that collection will receive those variables. Right? And one question that comes up too sometimes is, does this work for unknown computers? Yes, it does. You can define collections or variables on the unknown computer's object, on the unknown computer's collection, and every unknown computer that comes in will get those collections. Problem is, it's not as flexible as if you have a defined computer object that is known, right? Because you're only going to ever have a couple of unknown computer objects, one for x86, one for x64, whereas if you have known records, you can configure those very uniquely, right? So any machine that is in a collection will receive every variable that is on that collection, right? So if you have a Windows 8 build collection as an example, and you want every machine on there to receive a certain set of values, then you could put those in the collection. And then maybe there's some machines in that collection that need some additional things. And so you could add those additional things as specific machine variables. So whenever we run, we get a combination of the two. The collection of machine variables are kind of additive. Very good option, right? Or if you just want to add it in one place, you could just add these variables to the machine object and create whatever you want, do it through code, and be good, right? So it's very common. In fact, on my blog, there is that discussion where I show how to image by a web page and add collections that way. And so if you're just going to add collections programmatically, why complicate things by putting it on the collection and the machine? Just put it on the machine. No big deal. That machine will exist through the period of time where you're imaging, and then you could programmatically also, as part of the task sequence, remove those variables. I show that again on my blog. Let me pull that up so you can at least see it, and I'll walk through it real quick. All right, so here's my my blog, and again, I walk through it. I show a web page essentially. This is old school. You could do this a number of different ways now. Probably I would choose to do this a different way myself, maybe through Orchestrator and definitely through PowerShell. But you get the idea. You can specify all this information, and ultimately, there's the code here, and ultimately it will be populated on the collection. All of these variables, on the machine. All of these variables are written to the machine, and then these items are available to the machine whenever it comes time to image. Here's the task sequence that uses those. And notice right here, remove imaging system from collection. Let me roll down to that. Last item, I'm just going to run a script, VB script, to now remove that system from the collection once imaging is complete, so I can get rid of those variables, I can get rid of the system. It works out very well, right? All right, and again, you can read that if you want to, but just to show the example. So the ability to add in collections or variables to collections programmatically, and the ability to do the same to machines programmatically is really big. So let's show a couple of examples of that. First of all, and just a reminder, you didn't see any variables there whenever I ran this. So I have a couple of examples. Here first is the create collection variables PowerShell and the equivalent for VB script. So if I look at this to create the variables, this is a bit of a longer script just for controlling some different items, right? You could maybe add to the computer locally, you could add remotely, whatever. There's sections down here where we're declaring, checking if the collection's there. If not, we handle that, and then we actually go through in the script and add the variables to an existing collection. Right? Pretty easy. Well, in PowerShell, it's actually even easier. I don't have as much error checking in here, but still, it's really easy. So if I open this in Notepad, you'll see all I'm doing is importing the ConfigMgr PowerShell module, changing to my site where I want to make the addition, and then leveraging a commandlet to add the collection variables that I want. Right, here they are. So let's go run these. So if I go to my command prompt and navigate to that folder, there's my PowerShell version, here's that. So I want to run that, put a dot there, and it runs. No big deal. You don't see that it did much of anything, but it actually did. So if I go to my collection now and look, then I'll have a collection variable. There it is. Right? And this was created by VB script. You can tell just by the name. Well, I can do the same thing in PowerShell. So if I open up PowerShell and then go back to my script and take my PowerShell script and drag it down here and then click in and run, it's going to go and do a similar thing. It's just going to go create a couple of variables. So now if I go look at this, look at the properties, in fact, now I have two variables, right? Just one created by VB script, one created by PowerShell. Okay, these are obviously simple, do-nothing variables, but just to illustrate the concept. Well, if I want to do the same thing by machine, I can do that too. I have a couple of scripts that do it very similar. The first one is VB script. It looks almost exactly the same. The only difference really is when we get down here, we're adding specifically machine variables, set machine variable, right? And the same thing in PowerShell, except here, we're just using a different commandlet. CM device variable, device name, variable value. And notice this one down here, just to show it, is mask. So this determines whether the variable is hidden by the dots or visible, right? So just like the other, I can run this as well. I hit dot for local, so that's created. Let me go ahead and run the PowerShell version of it. Run, and it creates. Right? So good enough. Now if I go to this object and look at variables, I have a couple right here. One by VB script, one by PowerShell. All right. Now, so these can be leveraged exactly like you could leverage the task sequence or the variables that were created as part of the task sequence itself. But there is a difference, right? So the difference really is in terms of bare metal imaging or existing client imaging, right? So if you're running through bare metal imaging, there's provision as we go through imaging to ask the site for different settings and retrieve them on the fly. One of those settings would be variables, right? So if you look in the task sequence log for a bare metal machine, you will see it asking for machine and collection variables. But if you have an existing client that you're running a task sequence through, we don't obtain the variables that way. We don't obtain the policy that way. It all comes down, all of this comes down by policy. So as I've been talking, I've really been waiting also for things to replicate. And if I come over to my test machine now and run, so I have these variables for sure set, right? You saw me set them. So if I run my script to dump my base variables, it'll run. It'll create my, oops, here, let me do this the right way. I really did. It's fine. Yeah, so it just created it, right? And so I have dumped my base variables. It looks just like it did. You don't see the custom ones that I've added. However, if I then go and retrieve policy, I should. If I wait just a second, right? So I'm going to go trigger machine policy. Off we go. And take me maybe a couple of seconds for me to wait for it, and then I can run this again and see that now those variables are available to this machine, and I can leverage them, right? It's just something to be aware of, because if you're bare metal, obviously we have to go retrieve everything on the fly at the moment so that we have it. If you're an existing client and you try to run a task sequence that needs variables, and you just create those variables on the objects, and then you go try to run the task sequence, and it doesn't work, it's not because it's necessarily broken. Maybe it is, but it could very well be that those variables aren't in the environment yet, right? So hopefully this has been long enough for me to wait, and I'll click reinstall and see if those variables have actually made it. All right, so let's see. And in fact, they have. So there they are, and they came down through policy. Has to be through policy. So anyway, so that's kind of a tour around how these things work. Obviously, some kind of really silly examples, but I hope illustrating the capabilities of what we can do. Again, I kind of said at the beginning this would be a bit of a shorter session. It is, but didn't want to leave the variable discussion kind of where it was. Certainly wanted to illustrate how you can use variables and other conditionals to detect the flow or to determine the logical flow of a task sequence, but wanted to spend a little bit more time at least just talking about the various ways that we can get variables into the environment, how we can leverage variables once they're in the environment, and different things, right? So we'll wrap it out for part 6, and we'll turn the corner and talk about something else in part 7.